Good morning and welcome to the Foreign Policy Research Institute's panel discussion on foreign militaries in Africa. We have with us this morning two gentlemen who are experts in their field on this issue. Mr. Paul Nantulya from the National Defense University, who's extensively studied China and its presence in Africa. And I'd also like to welcome Raphael Parens, a 2024 Templeton Fellow in FPRI's Eurasia program, who will discuss the Russian presence in Africa. This is an issue that's of great importance at the moment, particularly given the problems that the U.S. Defense Department has been having with its military presence in Africa, especially in the Horn of Africa. Before our panelists get started, I would like to welcome all of you and remind you that these programs from FPRI, while they are free to you, the participants, they're not free to us. And so we would welcome any who are not members of FPRI who would like to join or who would simply like to support our programs of bringing more knowledge of the world to the public around the world and building better understanding. We greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions of our panelists as they are speaking and as we're discussing the issue, please put them in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and we will take them up about midway through and try to get to each one of them as we can. Each of our panelists will do a brief introduction of their take on this topic, and then we'll have a very short discussion, and then we will go to you, our audience, for your questions. I'd like to start by asking Paul Nantulya from the National Defense University to speak, and then Raphael Parens. Paul, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ray. It's a pleasure, as usual. I'm honored to be on an FPRI panel. If I'm not mistaken, this might be my seventh, I've lost count. So very, very happy to be here. And welcome to all the participants, and shout out to Raphael Parens. Let me just outline China, because that is my area of focus. I had the benefit of visiting Beijing. I got back last week on a tour to talk to different delegates that were on the ground in Beijing attending the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation Summit. That included diplomatic missions and all that. So that was a very interesting time to be on the ground, because security was a big part of this FOCAC summit. China's security engagements, its military activities on the African continent have been increasing and are set to increase further after the commitments that came out of this FOCAC summit. China has been looking for opportunities to scale up and improve its power projection capabilities and its military capabilities overall. The African continent has provided China with an avenue or an opportunity of doing that. Since 2008, the People's Liberation Army Navy has been conducting counter-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden, that's on the Indian Ocean coast, just off the coast of Somalia. And some of those operations are set to expand into the Gulf of Guinea. This is an area of interest that Chinese military scholars have been writing about, in both officially and unofficially. So if we look at those engagements, they have been growing in scope, in sophistication, also in terms of endurance, and in terms of the capabilities that we have seen the Chinese Navy deploy in African waters. Those operations have also given the Chinese military opportunities that it has seized to train with African forces. Quite a number of naval exercises have taken place on the African continent. These have basically become routine for China, which was not the case before the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation started in 2000. So we have seen that activity increase. China, as we all know, has established its first and only, so far, only military base in Djibouti, in the African nation of Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa. Out of that base, China is able to do quite a few things. It has been able to support its exercises with African forces. It has conducted military diplomacy. It has engaged in evacuation efforts, for instance, in Libya, in Yemen, more recently in Sudan. Chinese forces are increasingly looking at this as a major component of their engagements on the African continent. China is also doing quite a bit in terms of military sales in the context of declining Russian sales as a result of the drying up of credits, of Russian credits, as a result of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia over its reinvasion of Ukraine. We have seen an uptick in Chinese military sales on the continent. Initially, Chinese weaponry in Africa was essentially small arms and light weapons. The PLA was an infantry heavy force. And so these are the sorts of weapons that China was selling to African customers. But over the past decade, we have seen more sophisticated and heavy armaments like tanks, sophisticated artillery systems, aircraft, fighter aircraft trainers. We have also seen China, selling patrol boats, even submarines to the likes of Algeria, combat helicopters, and that sort of thing. So, China has really found a market, has been pushing very, very hard, and many of its top defense or contractors like Norinco have established a presence in a number of African countries, more recently Senegal, right? So China has really been making a push in this direction. China has also been doing quite a bit when it comes to professional military education. Prior to the COVID pandemic, China was training more African senior military officers in its military academies than any other industrialized country, including the United States. That kind of fell off in 2020, 2021, 2022 because of the COVID pandemic. A lot of that training went online. But coming out of this recent summit in Beijing, China has now basically surpassed the training that it was doing earlier before the pandemic. So over the next 3 years, China has offered 6,000 slots for senior military officers in various Chinese military academies, an additional 500 for non-commissioned officers and junior officers. This is a new area for China. In addition to 1,000 training opportunities for African police and law enforcement personnel. Police and law enforcement has become critically important to China. Over the past 5 to 6 years, China has trained over 2,000, according to the Chinese government and the African press, those that, African media organizations that monitor this type of activity. China has trained at least 2,000 African law enforcement personnel in various police academies, such as the People's Armed Police Academy in Beijing, the Public Security University, and so on. Quite a number of things that China is also doing on that front. We've seen an increase in extraditions. China, when FOCAC started in 2000, China did not have a single extradition agreement with any African country. These are now increasing. The situation has changed. We have seen China send police personnel into different African countries to interdict Chinese individuals that are wanted, in China for a range of issues such as, counterterrorism, according to what the Chinese government is saying. We've seen such operations being conducted, for instance, in Uganda at the beginning of last year, a major operation that was conducted between Ugandan and Chinese special police operators to capture wanted Chinese fugitives, some of whom escaped into the Democratic Republic of Congo. This made big news. It was a huge topic of discussion last year, but it wasn't new. China has conducted such operations with the likes of Angola, in Mozambique. China has interdicted the mainland Chinese and Taiwanese in Kenya and conducted a repatriation. It was quite controversial because in that particular instance, the High Court stopped the Kenyan government from doing it, but nevertheless, the Kenyan and the Chinese police collaborated in conducting that operation. So I have painted a picture here of a trend that we have seen in Chinese military and security engagements on the African continent, and these are set to increase over the next 3, 4, 5 years under the FOCAC mechanism. So I think I'll stop there for now.
All right, thank you, Raphael.
Hi, thank you, Ambassador Ray, for having me. So I think the three kind of drivers that I want to focus on when talking about foreign military activity in Africa are counterterrorism, resource extraction, and great power competition. Counterterrorism kind of doesn't need much introduction. I think we're seeing a large wave of jihadist activity, both in West Africa and the Lake Chad basin, kind of across the continent, and kind of the reactions to those have been manyfold. We've seen coups in West Africa. We've seen other developments across the continent, and now the question is about what deployments will look like in terms of U.S. deployments, Russian deployments. Obviously, there's been the growth of Wagner Group recently in West Africa. We also have the U.S. deployment ending in Niger, and kind of what that looks like going forward. And we also have both Russian and Turkish involvement in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali as well. Then on the resource extraction side, we have Wagner Group being involved in Central African Republic in timber, gold, and diamonds. Although they've been quite less successful in Mali, we also have potential Turkish and Russian involvement in Burkina Faso and Niger. And then, of course, there's the question of Democratic Republic of Congo, where obviously resource extraction plays a huge role in the involvement of a large number of foreign individuals, mostly private companies, and other African countries who are involved in the resource extraction game there. And lastly, we have, of course, great power competition. Russian involvement on the continent primarily involves coup-proofing military leaders and junta leaders. Russian activity also involves disinformation against the West, which has led to the exit of French and American military and political forces from countries across West Africa, particularly Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. However, the West needs to be careful with how they respond because these issues are not black and white. And I think we can kind of get into that as we move forward. But thank you, Ambassador, for having me.
Oh, thank you both. It's really sort of hard to decide where to ask the first question, but here you have basically China growing its military footprint across the continent in ways that could be troubling in a sense, because they are going into areas that the Russians don't really go into, and that's establishing really a solid set of relationships across security sectors. How does that impact future U.S. Africa policy, Paul?
Yeah, I think, China is certainly engaging in more sectors in a more systematic way than the Russians. I think the Russian engagement is, compared to what the Chinese are doing, is first of all, it's not as resourced. Secondly, it's not as the Chinese engagement is really expansive across multiple sectors. The other thing with Chinese engagement is that it's also very incremental. So it doesn't happen with a big bang effect. It's very incremental. It's very calibrated, very modulated, to such an extent that the picture that I discussed, earlier, if you look at the African press, there's very, very little discussion on Chinese military engagement, simply because it does not occur in public view, right? So all these activities, for instance, there was a major Chinese military exercise with Tanzania last month. They exercised for about a month. It was the largest Chinese military deployment in Africa since 2000. Chinese troops and equipment were brought in from mainland China for the first time, because usually in Chinese exercises, the tendency is to use forces and equipment that are already in theater, either at the military base in Djibouti or conducting counter-piracy patrols in the region. And those forces will then be rerouted to then conduct exercises with countries. But this time, Chinese forces came in from the mainland, and the kind of equipment that was deployed and used in that exercise was on a scale that has not been seen before. And even the exercise itself was much more demanding than the other exercise that the Chinese side has conducted. And there's a sense, from Beijing, that this type of exercise is going to continue. It's set to continue in future, simply because the Chinese have an interest in testing, fielding, and improving those capabilities, right? But nevertheless, there was very little discussion about that exercise, right, in the African press. So again, all these things tend to occur outside public view. Part of the reason for that is that China has very deliberately framed its military engagements on the African continent within the context of things like peacekeeping operations, things like host nation capacity building. I mean, these are things that are very difficult to argue against or argue with. Secondly, and this is very deliberate messaging, strategic messaging, and communications messaging on the Chinese side. The other element to it is that China has basically framed its military engagements on the continent in the context of a light footprint. So every time there's pushback on Chinese military engagement on the continent, such as its base in Djibouti, the Chinese response will be, but the UK, France, United States have a much larger footprint when it comes to military basing and military facilities on the continent and in other parts of the world. The Chinese side has only one base, right? Now, that obviously needs to be unpacked. But to African ears, it tends to make a lot of sense, in the sense that this is what they can see, or rather, this is, it's taken at face value, right? So what makes Chinese engagement much more difficult to track, engage with, and respond is the manner in which China itself presents those activities, and the manner in which and the ways in which that communication is received by African audiences. So it makes it extremely difficult, and particularly challenging when it comes to adopting effective policy responses.
Thank you. You mentioned the Western countries vis-a-vis China, but and Raphael, I'd like to throw this one to you. How do you think the growing Chinese military and security influence in Africa will mesh with what Russia is doing? I mean, because both are looking at resource extraction and resource access. Is there potential for China-Russia
Competition?
abrasion. Competition, yes, that's a good word.
I don't think so at this point, unless China moves towards the private military company model. I think kind of Russian and Chinese security interests are relatively siloed, which, as was mentioned by Paul, Russia's ability to do weapon sales right now in Africa is severely limited by the war in Ukraine. So while China is very much more involved on that side, Russia is taking a backseat, although we'll see. That is a potential area of competition in the future if Russia can get back to kind of the level of weapon sales that we saw in the past. Other than that, I don't necessarily see China getting very involved on the kind of mercenary and security force assistance side in that lens, mostly because it involves kind of a willingness to take casualties that China hasn't necessarily shown, and also China's kind of force structure and relationship with private military companies is very much different relative to Russia. Although private military companies are illegal in Russia, there's a lot more wiggle room than there actually is in China.
Paul, you'd like to add anything to that?
Can you repeat the question?
Well, I mean, you have both China and Russia with a military presence, albeit of a different nature. And my sense is that while China has strategic interests, it also has this interest in access to resources, which is behind a lot of what motivates the Russian PMCs. Oh, I mean, they're not there out of the goodness of their hearts. They're there to ensure Russian access to resources, along with giving the West. Given this resource competition, for despite the differences in the nature of their deployments, for competition or conflict between Russia and China, and at some point.
Well, protecting or establishing access to resources is important to China and has always been. This goes back to the 60s. Resources have always, especially after China went into this phase of reform and opening up after the Cold War, right? Resources became like oil and all that, explaining China's close relations, for instance, with Sudan, where it built, and it was quite controversial during the Civil War. China built Sudan's oil infrastructure, right? And had to pay a price reputationally, especially with the rebels who eventually became the government of South Sudan, although China has now repaired that relationship. So resource extraction has been a key feature of Chinese foreign policy. But I would argue it's not the only feature. There are countries like Burundi that hardly have resources, hardly offer China anything by way of resources, but China has a very tight relationship with Burundi. China also has very good relations with Rwanda. Rwanda hardly has resources, hardly has anything to offer by way of resources. You look at Mauritius, you look at Seychelles. Seychelles, between 2020 and 2021, over 90% of its military arsenal came from China. Seychelles hardly offers resources, to China. Countries like Madagascar, right? Important military engagements there, right? So China is engaging countries across the board. Gambia, is another example. Burkina Faso, which switched relations from Taipei to Beijing, right? Burkina Faso hardly offers anything in terms of resources, but has been a key node in China's expansion of its interests in the Sahel region, right? Mali has been destabilized, right, and economically is struggling, right? But China has been strengthening its military. In fact, the one military deal that was signed at the recent summit in Beijing was between China and Mali, the Malian junta, which again is quite controversial because that junta is under sanctions by the African Union and the Economic Community of West African States. So China is engaging across the board. It is engaging countries that offer resource access, countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Mozambique. But China is also engaging countries that don't offer, that are not resource endowed. Even countries like Lesotho that are completely surrounded by South Africa. China is engaging Lesotho in a very serious way when it comes to law enforcement, forensics, and that sort of thing, right? Providing training to its police forces and that type of thing. So China is engaging across the board. Its foreign policy is not predicated on resource extraction only. It's predicated on a whole range of interests.
All right, thank you. I have one last question, and then we'll go to our audience, which has several questions already in the queue. There's been a reaction on the part of the U.S. Congress to Russia's activities in Africa, the draft legislation on dealing with Russian malign activities on the continent. And while China is the, quote, #1 competitor to the U.S., there's been very little discussion in Washington about dealing with the growing Chinese military and security influence on the African continent. You sort of alluded to that, Paul, and when you said that the Chinese military presence is almost invisible, although one wonders how in doing the things they've done, it could still be completely invisible. I mean, but where do you see that going in terms of assessing which of the two are most concerning in terms of long-term effect on U.S. security? Which is most concerning, Russia or China?
Well, it's difficult. It's difficult to know. It's difficult to tell. But let me just get back to what you said about the invisibility. The invisibility has to do with how China conducts, basically with Chinese security behavior. With Chinese security behavior in Africa. So if you go to a typical African country, or to any African country, right, you're not going to find Chinese troops, walking on a street or in a vehicle. Or at an embassy or things of that nature. You will, the Chinese troop presence, imagery of the Chinese troop presence in Africa has been primarily in the context of a peace operation. So Africans interact with the PLA in a peace environment. I saw this during my time in South Sudan, because there were Chinese troops that served with the UN mission in South Sudan, which I interacted with a lot. And when you sort of see what this UN mission for South Sudan does, it does, civil operations, vaccinations, things of that nature. And so South Sudanese, this is the contact that South Sudanese have with the Chinese military. It is in that context. So wherever there's a UN mission, because China deploys to most UN missions in Africa, whenever you have a UN mission, whether it's in Mali, the Democratic Republic of Congo, if you look at the interaction of local African communities with these missions, this is where the interaction with the PLA is. The interaction with the PLA is not with, for instance, with the forces that are conducting counter-piracy patrols off the Indian Ocean coast. It is not going to be with the combat forces, the Chinese combat forces that are at the base in Djibouti, because how many Africans have access to that military base anyway? I mean, there are times when the Chinese will bring journalists to that base. It does happen once in a while, right? But those forces are not going to go out to interact with African media, with African audiences, and that sort of thing. You understand? So there's a difference in terms of Chinese military behavior. It will not be like what you see when you go to Abidjan, okay, or when you go to Cote d'Ivoire, or when you go to Kenya, and you will see British troops. I mean, the British, they've got a big base out there. It's a huge facility, and the Kenyan public is used to seeing British personnel in uniform, right? But to see a PLA combat troops in Kenya, it will always be in the context of, they might be rotating to conduct a mission in Djibouti or to conduct a mission in Mali, but it will not be specifically tied to Kenya's security, for instance. So that's where, these are very subtle differences that, that kind of camouflage. I think the word is Chinese security engagement on the African continent is very camouflaged. And that, yeah, it's very, very well camouflaged. So I think that, that's what I would say with regard to that question.
Raphael, you'd like to add something to that?
Yeah, and I think while the Chinese approach is definitely appears to be camouflaged, the Russian approach is anything but that. By supporting juntas and by encouraging disinformation and by trying to compete directly with the West, especially in West Africa and Central African Republic, the Russian approach through Wagner Group, through the Africa Corps now, is very much counter-democratic, counter-liberal values, pushing for military juntas to take and maintain power. And of course, that's obviously going to rub the West the wrong way. And while it has been somewhat successful in pushing, the French mission out of Mali, French and other forces out of Central African Republic, it's unclear how useful that model is going to be going into the future, particularly as terrorist events happen in Bamako this past week, as jihadist attacks grow in Burkina Faso and Niger. It's unclear how stable or the long-term perspectives are for these countries and for these juntas kind of moving forward.
Okay, well, that actually leads us to the first question from our audience. It appears that Russia's PMCs in Africa are losing traction, and Africa differently at their options. Reality or wishful thinking? Is there room for China, for the U.S. to re-engage, or have we already been preempted by China? Who wants to take a shot at that one first?
I can take a shot.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Raphael.
Yeah, I don't think Russian PMCs are necessarily leaving Africa. I think there is some switch from Wagner Group to Africa Corps, which is more directly backed by the Russian state. That comes with its own kind of host of issues, because while Wagner Group was nominally independent, it definitely had some backing from the Kremlin. Now that Africa Corps is completely backed by the Kremlin, it means that all of its decisions, all of its human rights violations are going to be under public scrutiny and will have some impact on Russian relations with these countries. But it also means that in a lot of ways, these relationships can continue because Russia can provide the perhaps monetary backing to maintain these relationships, and they won't need to rely on perhaps controversial figures to run their programs, shall we say.
Paul, you want to?
Yes, I think on the PMC side, and personally, when it comes to the Chinese context, I don't like the term private, because they're not private. They are hired by Chinese state-owned enterprises. Chinese state-owned enterprises have the budgets that pay for Chinese security firms, right? And Chinese security firms are engaged in protecting Chinese Belt and Road infrastructure and projects in different parts of Africa and the developing world. In Africa, there are about 10,000 Chinese firms. Over 70% of them are state-owned enterprises and mostly engaged in large construction projects and that sort of thing. right? So we have seen, and I've done a report on this, an increased footprint of Chinese security firms. Some of them support the counter-piracy patrols at sea, Chinese counter-piracy patrols at sea, but most of them are deployed on land. They provide security assistance to host forces, they provide intelligence, they provide surveillance, they provide equipment, they provide money. They also work very closely with a private, now that is where I'll use the term, private security companies in African countries, in places like South Africa, Kenya, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and places like that, right? But they are not as operational. So in other words, they don't fight. They're not a boots on the ground kind of Wagner type operation, not by any stretch. So it's mostly indirect, it's mostly standoff. However, there are a breed of Chinese security firms that are that could become as operational as Wagner. So if you look at the Frontier Services Group, which is based in Hong Kong, and it has operations in Somalia, in Horn of Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it is top heavy, right? It engages in logistics, it engages in all kinds of things, right? Now, this is very interesting because it is a Chinese firm, but which uses Western security expertise, right? Primarily from retired, British, US, special forces and that sort of thing. So you do have a breed of Chinese firm that are Chinese owned, but which use Western expertise. These have the potential to become much more operational on the ground. But when you talk to Chinese researchers, there is a sense that over the next 10 years, these firms that China deploys on the continent are likely to become more and more operational, because every time there's a discussion within the Chinese milieu, within the Chinese environment of security contracting, they always talk about Western security firms like Sandline International, these big, black. They talk about Blackwater a lot. They talk about Blackwater a lot. So they are obviously looking into ways in which security firms can provide a bigger security blanket, simply because the activities that they're conducting on the African continent and in different parts of the global south are confronting very serious security challenges, kidnappings, hijackings, and that sort of thing. And there's still an aversion within the Chinese military establishment, at least, to deploy the People's Liberation Army in large numbers to be able to counter some of those threats. There's still an aversion. As to how long that aversion remains is an open question.
Okay. We talked about, I think, Raphael, you mentioned Turkey's military presence in Africa. Can you expand on that? What are the Turks doing in Africa?
Yes, so there are allegations, and these have not been confirmed. In fact, the companies involved have put out statements saying that they're not true. But we have some idea that there are in fact Turkish private military companies that are involved in sending Syrian mercenaries who transit through Turkey to fight counterterrorism or to conduct counterterrorism operations in Niger and Burkina Faso. And in these operations, it looks like they're working for Russian commanders. This creates a whole host of problems. One of them is that many of these Syrian operators have fought the Russians in the past in Syria. So that could create one layer of issues. A second layer is that obviously these Syrian fighters who are coming over are Sunni, and they're in fact fighting Sunni jihadist forces. That could create long-term issues, whether it's in Africa or in Turkey or in Syria. But they are involved. There's also the involvement of Turkish military sales to Mali, and I think also Burkina Faso. Yeah, those have mostly been drones, which have then themselves been used for attacks that have killed large amounts of civilians in the name of attacking jihadist groups. So those will obviously also create issues going forward.
Right. One more on Turkey. Is Turkey highlighting its Islamic culture to leverage acceptance of its military?
I don't have a good answer on that. I think that's a good question, probably bears some further research.
Okay. Paul, you have any information on that?
Turkey, I don't really have much information on that, but Turkey is certainly very engaged, you know, in places like Somalia, supporting counterterrorism efforts there, and has been increasing its footprint. It's difficult to tell whether it uses Islamic culture to promote acceptance of its security forces, but Turkey does have a strong culture exchange program, right? That it has been conducting, especially in Muslim majority countries in Africa. It does have a cultural component, a very strong cultural component. But as to whether that component is linked to its military engagement is quite difficult to pinpoint.
Okay. Another question. Can you elaborate on the United Arab Emirates military involvement in Africa?
Sure, I could take this one. So there are again allegations that the UAE is involved in financing military operations in Sudan. Obviously, that is fraught on whichever side, and there's been back and forth about which side they've been supporting. I think most recently it's been the RSF, which is the Rapid Support Forces, fighting against the nominally elected SAF, but realistically they're both military factions fighting against each other, and the UAE's involvement in that has likely contributed to significant human rights violations, all of those sorts of things. There have been allegations of UAE being involved in child soldier deployments from Sudan to Libya. So that's obviously a problem. Other than that, the UAE is also involved in being a third party point of movement for illegal gold that's smuggled out of Mali, Sudan, and also Central African Republic, likely smuggled into Russia. But that's kind of the one of the legs along the resource extraction route, especially for gold.
Okay. We have another question here, which Paul is typing an answer to, but I think we'd like maybe have that answer available, Paul, for the general audience on Chinese training for security forces.
Yeah, the Chinese are training. So, you know, as I mentioned before, the Chinese are training more African security professionals than any other industrialized country, including the United States. So it's worth paying attention to. I've done a report. I did a report, actually a couple of reports, actually maybe 3 reports, maybe 4, that have tried to look at what African officers that have been trained in China and the United States think about the training that they receive in both countries and how they compare. This report very quickly highlights 3 things. One, that the African side African officers still consider United States training in particular to be more superior, to be more challenging in terms of critical thinking, to be more relevant in terms of the security issues that they're confronting. And more importantly, it allows for a greater level of relationship building because African and American forces train and work together for the entire duration of whatever program you're talking about, whether it's at the junior level or at the level of the National Defense University and National War College type training. In China, strategic level training is segregated, right? So foreign officers study on different campuses from their Chinese counterparts. So they only interact with their professors and with other individuals that will be brought in to teach. So it kind of defeats the purpose of relationship building. Secondly, the American side is seen to be doing a better job when it comes to maintaining alumni networks. So it brings different alumni back to the United States and also conducts alumni programs on the African continent. So the African side appreciates American training. So there's definitely a good value proposition that American training has on the table, and American training is very, very competitive. And I'm not saying this out of bias, I'm a national defense university, but it is very, very competitive. However, and this is the big, big question, China is providing way more training opportunities for African forces. And in the studies that I've done, I've spoken with general staffs in different parts of Africa. I've spoken with chiefs of training, and the response is almost always uniform. That the African side prefers to send, and I will quote directly, we prefer to send our best and brightest to the United States. And they will even name the institutions, West Point, the U.S. Naval Academy, and so on, right? Fort Leavenworth, so on. However, if trainers from Nanjing come over to my office and offer me 50 slots over the next 12 months, that's where I'm going to train my people, right? So these are fully subsidized slots. And, these are year-round opportunities. And when you talk to the Chinese side, they say that all these opportunities are basically taken up. They don't have a problem where supply is outstripping demand. They are responding to a demand that's there on the African continent. So I think that raises a lot of questions, and I think we need to do a lot of thinking around how we might go around that problem.
Okay. We had several other questions that were answered directly, and I was looking here to see if there are others. Here's one that sort of relates, Paul, to what you just said, and that's, you think the countries of the West, and let's just say specifically the U.S., will be able to sustainably compete with China and Russia when it comes to offering value to African countries. And of course, I would assume that by value, that's value by as these countries define
it. Ambassador Ray, growing up in Africa, I can tell you that the mind of an average African student, when it comes to improving one's skills, one's profile, the mind is oriented towards the Western Academy. Everybody talks about, it was our dream. It's the dream of many an African professional to come to Stanford, to come to Harvard, to come to Oxford, to come to Cambridge. Very rarely, if ever, do you hear an African professional say, I want to go to Beijing Normal University, or I want to go to, whichever, the Pudong political school in Shanghai, right? Very rarely do you hear that. Now, I am not denigrating non-American academic institutions. That's not my goal. My goal is simply to articulate how American education is perceived on the African continent. It is perceived to be of tremendous value. It is perceived to be a must-have in terms of increasing one's employability when one returns home. And the vast majority of African students do want to go home after they complete their education. The problem is that there are so many hurdles that are placed in the way of African professionals seeking education in the United States. I was shocked. I was reading a study. I was looking at a study sponsored by the US government that was looking at the trends, the visa rejection trends over the last 5 years. In 2022 and 2023, the visa rejection rate for students from West Africa coming into the United States was 74%. 74% of Western African students, many of them who had applied for Fulbright scholarships and Fulbright opportunities to come to the United States, were rejected, right? So part of being competitive in the academic space, because the academic space is huge, and this is something that the Chinese have seized, right? Because the Chinese are educating more African professionals than any other industrialized country, and not just military professionals, right? It's a space, it's a site of competition, and it's a site where the American value added is clear. It does not even have to be articulated. But the problem is, how do we address the obstacles to well-meaning students that would like to have an opportunity to come and study in the United States? I think this has to be part of the discussion when we talk about strategic competition in Congress, in the administration, and in academia. We got to find a solution to this problem.
Okay. Okay, one other question here, and this is an interesting one that I had not thought of. Are there any African PMCs?
Yes, they are. Many of them, I mean, South Africa is a perfect example. In fact, South Africa had to come up with laws to prevent and to punish their citizens for engaging in that kind of work. I mean, South African private military companies have effected some serious changes of government in West Africa. These are groups like Sandline International and others, right? So many of them were broken up. But after apartheid, many of the former demobilized security forces of the apartheid establishment and the establishments of the those that had been demobilized even from the liberation movements went into this in a very big way. So yes, you do have African PMCs that are around. The most well-developed are from South Africa, but other African countries do get into this kind of work. So yes, when we talk PMCs, we should also be talking about African ones.
What's the relationship between the African PMCs and, say, Africa Corps, Wagner Group, or the Chinese security firms?
That's an interesting question. The Chinese security firms do work with registered African security firms because they're all over the place. I mean, these are the guys that are going to be protecting you in Nairobi. These are the guys that are going to be deploying, I mean, it's a normal thing in Africa. The private security industry in Africa is big, right? So what Chinese security firms have done is they have formed partnerships with these organizations, which legally can be more operational on the ground. So what the Chinese security firms will do is basically provide them enablers, right, to do their work because it is difficult for the Chinese have had a difficult time registering their firms using the local laws and legislation. So they do work with these African groups like Group 4 Security, G4S. There's so many of them. The Chinese firms are spoiled for choice when it comes to partners in the African security industry.
Raphael?
Yeah, I would also note that Executive Outcomes, which is, as Paul mentioned, one of the South African PMCs from the 1990s, that's actually the kind of model that Wagner Group built themselves on. There's this alleged meeting in 2010 between the Russian General Staff, and Eben Barlow, who is the Director of Executive Outcomes. And we think from that meeting, contributed to kind of the organization of this group, both as a mercenary organization, but also as, a resource extraction outfit. So that model exists, and yes, there's legislation for sure against it in South Africa. But that doesn't mean that these organizations don't work elsewhere in Africa. We've seen them at play in Mozambique to similar results as Africa Corps, unfortunately. Or sorry, to Wagner Group, in that they weren't very, very equipped to defeat the Islamic State affiliates in Cabo Delgado. However, I think it's also important to talk about other African militaries becoming involved in conflicts across Africa. I think the biggest partners in this most recently have been Rwanda, and then Kenya also to some extent. Rwanda is very involved in the Central African Republic as a peacekeeping and kind of peace enforcement force against insurgent forces that would be interested in overthrowing President Touadera's government. Although we like to talk about Wagner Group a lot in the Central African Republic, these other forces are also very involved, and there are also significant proxy military involvement in DRC and in that kind of resource extraction and proxy force combination of activities. So I think that trend is going to continue moving forward, and is something that we also need to be thinking about.
Right. Another question. Is Iran a source of drones and missiles to African countries, either directly or through Russia or other third parties? Raphael, you want to take a crack at that?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think they have been able to secure that so far. The only opportunity that I could see where that might happen is Niger, where in fact one of the reasons that the U.S. and Nigerian relations broke down was because the U.S. in many ways was dictating terms about whether the Nigerian government could in fact deal with the Iranians, especially when it came to dealing with resource extraction projects around uranium and that sort of thing. So there's a possibility that could evolve in the future. However, the sanctions regimes on Iran are stringent enough that it would make it particularly difficult.
Okay. Well, one last question before we close out here, and this no, Paul's already answered that. But Paul, I think that's one that everyone in our audience might be interested in, and that is it possible for training to look at both the actions on the part of either the U.S. or China and offering training to someone who's been trained in the other country?
Yes, and I just answered a question to that effect in the room. Yes, African countries do seem to be sending, especially their senior officers that have been earmarked for high-level promotions, to China and the United States. And it's interesting because a lot of the officers I had spoken with were trained in both China and the United States, right? So you have African officers that have trained in the same level institutions, right? So Army Command College Nanjing, and then they'll send him or her to Fort Leavenworth, okay? They'll send, I spoke with many officers that are trained at the PLA National Defense University in Beijing, and had also trained at the National Defense University in Washington, right? So African countries increasingly are doing that. And it's the defense attaches that African countries deploy. The most important deployment right now for any African rising officer, the most important deployments as defense attaché will be either Beijing or Washington. And they will, you have attachés that have served in both environments, right? So it's the high level. At that high level, African countries are doing that. Now, I think there's need for more research in terms of why African countries have found that, why African countries are doing that. Do they want to, what is it that, that is informing those decisions. But yes, you do have officers that have both experiences, and I think it's good news for the US side, because it means that African countries are pushing for diverse options. They want to diversify, and because they want to diversify, it means that there are opportunities for American engagement, right? I think we would be worried if there's a preference for one or the. I think there's a tendency to kind of look at the training in China and therefore just looking at that in terms of from a competitive standpoint. But I think it's much more complex. It's much more complex than that. But what the data is saying is that there's a clear preference for US training if it can be provided. US training is still seen as offering better value in the long run, ultimately.
Great. Thank you. I want to thank both of your time and your outstanding offerings today. And I apologize to the audience. We didn't get to all of our questions. Thankfully, Paul got several of them that he answered directly. I regret that we weren't able to share all of his answers with all of you. This session is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel within 24 to 48 hours. I encourage you to share it with your network and with those who were unable to attend. Again, remind you to support FPRI's programs, especially the Africa program, which is designed to try and bring more knowledge of the African continent to more people, to dispel a lot of the myths and misinformation that exists about the continent. We look forward to seeing you at future programs, and thank you all for being here.